Hey everybody, welcome to ARE Live. I'm Mark Tier, the founder of Black Spectacles. Today I'm with Mike Newman, and we're going to be reviewing our mock exam for the ARE 5.0 Practice Management Exam. This exam, as we were talking about earlier, Mike, is mostly pretty new exam content, stuff that 4.0 didn't totally cover. So the topics we're going to be covering here may very well be new, and I think the mock exam that we put together is going to help folks, get a sense of some of the key concepts that are covered.
Yeah, most of the material will be similar to programming, planning, and practice and some of the other stuff that was covered. But the fact that they have a particular exam just in practice management is definitely a new way of thinking about it. And so there's sort of a new lens on a lot of the same old information.
Yeah. Before we get started, if you'd like to attend our next ARE Live broadcast, where we'll be focusing on the second ARE 5.0 exam, which is project management. Be sure to visit blackspectacles.com/podcast to register. And during the broadcast, just like today, you'll have a chance to ask questions to the group and of Mike. And as you guys probably know, here at Black Spectacles, we've built a comprehensive ARE 4 and 5 exam curricula, that you can utilize, to prepare for the exams. I often like to remind folks that if you'd like your boss to pay for your Black Spectacles membership, be sure to tell them about our firm licenses, which are really sort of designed for any sort of size of firm, whether you have 10 folks at your firm or 10,000 people. We have a variety of different licenses and lots of different tools and so forth that make that work really well. So just visit blackspectacles.com/firms to learn more about that. And then at the end of today's episode, we're actually going to be tracking the everyone's answers to the mock exam. It looked like almost half of the folks who registered submitted answers. So thank you for doing that. Pretty overwhelming response, I would say. And what we're going to do is we'll choose somebody from all the folks who submitted their answers, and they'll win a free 1-month ARE Prep Black Spectacles subscription. And we'll be tracking all the answers. And for everyone who gets every single answer right, you'll get a free Black Spectacles t-shirt. So stay tuned for that too. As I mentioned, Mike Newman is with us. If you don't know Mike, he's an adjunct professor at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. He's also the founder of Shed Studio, and he's the instructor for Black Spectacles online ARE exam prep curriculum, which if you haven't already checked it out, head over to blackspectacles.com to watch any of the free exam prep tutorials for the courses. And tonight, we'll be taking questions using the GoToWebinar question box, as well as on Twitter using the ARE Live podcast hashtag. But first, I'd like to hand it over to Mr. Newman.
All right. We're going to dive right in. Sorry about the short delay there. And as Mark said in the intro, that practice management is, it's essentially the same material. It's just, as we were saying, a sort of different lens on how you look at that material. And so this is really coming from NCARB and AIA put together a big, long survey a couple of years ago and talked to literally 1,000 people around the country and asked them kind of, what was the exam not helping with? And they got this overwhelming response. They got lots of responses all over the map on all the other topics, but they got this overwhelming response that people weren't feeling like that they were being encouraged to learn how to just stop and start a practice. How do you actually make a business work? And so the questions that we're going to be starting to talk about today are just sort of about kind of issues that you would need to know in order to start a practice. So kind of where you want to, what kind of direction you want the practice to go in, how you're going to get work, how you're going to respond to requests from potential clients, just kind of all the different sort of aspects of that. And we'll just touch on a few of them for tonight because it's a short process here. But you can kind of see that the idea here is really just anything that would give you an opportunity to really think about, right, how do you make an architectural practice start? Like, what would you need to know? So let's just sort of dive in and kind of run through a few of these questions. The first one we're going to look at here, a couple of these are a little wordy, so apologies, but let's just dive right into this first one. A potential roofing material supplier suggests a different roofing material than the architect had been considering, and as an inducement to get them to try something new, is willing to provide the architect a 10% return after the material has been procured by the GC. The architect should do what? We have a couple different possibilities here. First one is inform the building code official as to their plans to use the newer material. B is discuss with the GC whether the material meets the needs of the project. C is use the initial material only. D is review the materials for adherence to the needs of the project and the project budget, and propose a material that best meets the needs without accepting financial return. So, all right, A, inform the building code official that you're going to be using the newer material. That's a reasonable answer. If you are, in fact, going to be using the newer material, A would certainly be a reasonable thing to do. B, discuss with the GC whether the material meets the needs of the project. Well, that's also a reasonable thing to do. The GC probably has some opinions about it. It would be useful to know about pricing and about a bunch of other aspects that the GC would have their finger on. So B, also fairly reasonable. So far we're not really putting anything out of possibility. C, use the initial material. Well, that's certainly doable. There's nothing wrong with sticking with your initial game plan. So that also is sort of plausible. But there's one key aspect to what's being asked in the question that's going to make all of those kind of moot. And when we look at D, what we're going to realize is that D is the only one that hits on that one particular aspect. So review the two materials for adherence to the needs of the project and the project budget. So it's mentioning both the needs of the project, i.e. the durability, the health, safety, and welfare issues, all of those kinds of issues, but also the project budget. But mostly it's going to say at the end here, so you choose the one that makes the most sense without accepting a financial return. This is a key thing. D is absolutely the correct answer. There are many different, even related professions that allow you to sort of play a little fast and loose with when you're procuring materials about who's paying for what and whether you get a little kickback or not. But the way this is written, this is clearly a kickback to the architect for choosing a particular roofing material. And if you're an interior decorator and you get to sort of bill at the list price, but get a special discount, and so you're making a little extra money, like nobody's going to throw you in jail because you're an interior decorator. It has a different relationship to the idea of profession. It's there's not the same expected level of concern about the health, safety, and welfare of the public. It's also it depends on the contract and a few of the different situations, but certain contractors have the ability to be able to do things like that. But an architect can never accept a kickback in this kind of situation. There is no sort of ethical way to do that. And that's because an architect is considered a professional and has a certain ethical relationship. And that ethical relationship, it would be not reasonable to ask an architect to put themselves in the position to be choosing between making more money or protecting the health, safety, and welfare of the public. So like in this particular example, roofing material, like if it's a EPDM versus a PVC or something, you know, there's probably not a lot of health, safety, and welfare worries in that situation. It's probably more just durability or appropriateness to the job at hand, and obviously the budget. But you can't let it start. You can't just because this particular one isn't an example where the health, safety, and welfare of the public hasn't been compromised. You just can't let it start. So the rules will always say that the architects cannot take money directly in that way because it is just an ethical problem that has to do with that protection.
And just to just as a reference, you may have mentioned this, but the kind of the, I guess the standard for this is articulated, correct me if I'm wrong, in the AIA Handbook for Professional Practice, right? That's kind of where we're getting this from?
Yeah, there's a whole ethical construct that you can actually find right on the AIA website, but
Yeah,
it's
good point.
also
That's
it's also pretty clearly put into the Handbook of Professional Practice, and it's a pretty extensive thing. There's a lot of different topics that show up on there. This is one of many. There's also issues about how to compete with each other, how to what it means to be a professional, all of that. There is a kind of interesting relationship between the AIA in this situation and the actual sort of governing body that licenses each of the individual candidates, and that the licensure is actually done by state. So each state has their own licensing board, and they're the ones who have the actual control over the licensure. But every one of the ones in the United States will have something that's very, very similar, specific on this topic, it's very similar, but pretty much will adopt the entire ethical sort of construct of that shows up in the AIA documents.
So that one is a little sort of cheat one. It's really just trying to lull you with a bunch of information. And the thing you're supposed to notice is the fact that it's talking about the return after the material was procured. That's clearly a kickback.
You should know that. You should be proud to know that very, very, very few people got this wrong.
Yes, good job. And just to put it into context, like we're saying, this is really about kind of running a firm. This is part of what the point of questions like this would be. First of all, to see if you know that, but it's also just trying to reinforce that there are codes of conduct, there is an ethical structure that you should be aware of, that if you're working for a firm and you're doing CD sets or 3D models in BIM or something like that, there's sort of you're not really expected to understand all of the code of conduct issues and how the contracts are going to relate to ethical issues and things like that. But if you're starting a practice, you absolutely are expected to understand what those issues are. And so this is one of those where the exam is partly in place here to test your knowledge on these things, and it's also partly in place to sort of put a flag in front of you to say, hey, don't forget, this is an issue you need to know about in order to run your firm.
Okay.
Look at the second one. Okay, a problem with the project has come up. There is a dispute between the contractor and the owner. Which of the following are possible ways that the dispute might be adjudicated? So this is one of those ones where it's not just a choose one out of the four. This is where you choose multiples. And so there are multiple correct answers here. So in a situation where there's a dispute and the dispute needs to be sort of figured out and somebody has to decide who's the winner of the dispute, there are a couple of very simple, straightforward answers to this situation. And then there's a couple other ones that are a little looser. So let's sort of run through the possibilities. So the first one, if anybody answered A, that's a little bit of a cheat on my part. I actually, when I was putting these together, I did a typo, and then I realized that it was actually kind of funny, so I left it in. So A says meditation, and meditation is probably a great way to go through dispute resolution. I would recommend it for everybody, but that is not going to be a possible answer on the NCARB exam. But mediation absolutely is. So G is certainly correct. Mediation is going to be the relatively low scale effort. It's going to be a sort of the simplest way in terms of when you have a third party reviewer come in. It's somebody that both parties can agree to. And when we talk about dispute resolution in this way, we're usually talking about a dispute between the owner and the contractor, though it could be any number of other players as well. But if it doesn't say specifically, you should assume that it's between the owner and the contractor. And so a mediation would be a situation where the contractor maybe chooses 3 different people to be a mediator, and the owner then chooses one of them, so that it's somebody that both parties agree to. They have enough sort of separation, standalone separation. But it's a relatively simple and low-key process. The mediators, they tend to be people who are like retired architects or retired contractors, so they have a lot of information already. They already know how things work, and now they're going to go through the documents and figure out what happened, and then they're going to sort of, after they talk to both parties, do something similar to a depositions. They're then going to make a decision. And that decision is sometimes binding, although not usually. Usually, if the parties don't agree to what happens with the mediation, it can then jump up to the next level. And the next level would either be arbitration or litigation. And it depends on the contract and a few other issues, but arbitration and litigation are the 2 next level dispute resolution setups. Litigation is obviously when you go to court. Arbitration is a lower level than going to court, but more intensive than doing mediation. So I essentially have something akin to a judge. In some jurisdictions, they actually call them judges. In others, they call them other arbiters and a few other terminology points. But arbitration is where you might have either a single person or a panel of 3. And it's a much more laborious process than mediation. But litigation is going to be even more, and is going to cost a lot more in terms of time and money. So mediation you might be able to get done in a month. Arbitration, maybe it takes 5-6 months, something like that. Litigation is going to be years, because it just takes a long time to get onto the calendar, and you have a lot of lawyers involved. So it's much more expensive. So the reason that mediation and arbitration exist is so that you don't have to get to litigation. And some contracts will mandate only arbitration, some will mandate mediation and then litigation. There's a bunch of different ways it can happen, but those 3 are the sort of the main 3 in terms of dispute resolution. But we're looking for 4. So then the question comes, which one is the other one? We already got rid of meditation, although, like I said, I like that one. If we look at C, so I'm going to cross out A. If we look at C, C is REPC. That's actually a real estate purchase contract. It has nothing to do with it. Real estate purchase contracts are often the thing that goes into litigation because that's just the nature of them. So they often show up there, but it's not a way that you would go through a dispute resolution. So A and C are definitely not it. Let's look down at the bottom. How about a lien? A lien is an interesting decision. A lien is something that is used, a mechanics lien it's usually referred to as a way to sort of start the dispute resolution process, but it's not how you would get it adjudicated. So a lien is a situation where, just as an example, let's say the owner didn't pay the general contractor and the contractor is owed $100,000, and they keep working for a little while, but then they still haven't gotten paid, and so something's not right. So they put a lien on the property. And so what that means is that they're saying, look, something's like, we're owed money from this owner / property. And so we're going to claim ownership by saying we're putting a lien on this. It rides with the deed so that anything that's going to happen on that property, any legal thing, try to sell it, trying to pay taxes, all of those things, that lien is going to show up on any legal thing that's happening on there. And it's a way to sort of tell the owner in that situation, we're serious, we want to get paid, you can't just ignore this. So it would start the process, but it's not the way that you would actually adjudicate the dispute. So lien is an interesting possible answer, but it's not really the correct fourth answer. And then we have barrister review and IDM. Well, barrister review just means a lawyer review. So anybody involved in any adjudication process is probably going to have a lawyer involved. Even if you have mediation, you're probably going to have a lawyer involved. So that just means you're reviewing with your lawyer. So that's not it. So then the only one left here for us is E, and that's the IDM, the initial decision maker, which is such a sort of bogus sounding name. But it's this kind of interesting thing that was put into the contracts. It sort of existed before, but then in the 2007 contracts, interestingly, the AIA contracts come out every 10 years on the 7. So in 2017 is the next set. But in the 2007 contracts, they very significantly sort of put into place this idea of the initial decision maker, and it's typically considered to be the architect. So the idea is this dispute comes up before we really get into mediation, or especially into arbitration or litigation, and before everything gets too out of hand and everybody's losing money and the project is stopped dead while we try to figure out what's going on. Instead, we go to the architect, and the architect takes off of their I'm an agent of the owner hat and puts on their IDM hat, meaning they're a professional, they're supposed to be able to look out for the health, safety, and welfare of everybody, and they are the initial decision maker. They are like a mediator, but just somebody who's part of the process, and now they are able to sort of help adjudicate this process. And if the different parties don't like it, then it can jump to mediation or arbitration. But IDM is definitely the fourth of this particular example.
Well done with meditation.
Yeah,
I think you got some people on that one for sure.
sorry, I apologize.
You're also evil.
Yeah, well, and actually, let me be clear that on the actual exam, they won't do that. They're not going to try to trick you like that. The reason I included it is because I just thought it was funny, because meditation would be actually a pretty good way to resolve disputes. But they're not going to try to trick you like that. They will trick you in ways like lien and the barrister review. These are all things that are part of the dispute resolution process. And so there will be correct answers, but there will be more correct answers. And that's always the trick is, sometimes you see one, you're like, oh, that's it. Right, and then you have to just remind yourself to go and keep looking through to find the other one.
It's one of those exam sort of techniques is make sure you read everything carefully, like Jason said in the comments here. And also one of the questions along the similar lines of, are they going to kind of, one question came through for IDM, and then you put in parentheses initial decision maker, so you typed it out. One of the questions was, are they going to try to maybe be a little tricky and like not write out initial decision maker? And my thought is, no, they're probably going to be explicit about it.
Yeah, I would imagine they would be explicit about it. I got to go back and forth on this. One of the things in the sort of previous versions of the exam, there's been a lot of discussion about how a lot of the questions were this kind of gotcha type question that was like something you had to know. And not something that but in most situations, architects can look things up. And so you don't necessarily need to be able to, memorize all of these things. So they have tried to move away from that and into situations where it's more about just kind of understanding what the ideas are, and then you can sort of answer these questions. But of course, it still makes a difference if you can remember the different titles. All right, next one. Here's another wordy one. They become less wordy as we go along. Number 3, your promotional materials say that you will produce the most beautiful and energy efficient building ever for each and every client! Exclamation point. The standard of care that you bring to the project is, so A, the finest attention to detail will be paid in order to bring the project in on time and under budget. B, the architectural team will attempt to make the most, in quotes, beautiful project for your needs, but will need reasonable and responsible support from the owner to do so. C, the architecture team will perform its services with the professional skill and care ordinarily provided by architects practicing in the same or similar locality under the same or similar circumstances. Or D, shall provide information in a timely manner regarding requirements for and limitations on the project, including written program which shall set forth the objective schedules, constraints, and criteria. So essentially what this is asking is, do you really get what the standard of care actually is? And the standard of care is a contractual understanding. So it's literally listed in the contract. And I'm just going to jump straight to the answer on this one. The answer is C. So those first two, A and B, those are not contractual statements. You can't, in your contracts, say the finest attention to detail will be paid, and like that doesn't mean anything. It's not something that could be adjudicated, like we were just talking about. It's not something that can be controlled in a contractual way. You can't really have the word beautiful in a contract, because like how would you be able to judge that? It just doesn't fit in terms of the contracts. But C, the architecture team will perform its services with the professional skill and care ordinarily provided by architects practicing in the same or a similar locality under the same or similar circumstances. That is the way that a contract is put together. The idea is that you are making competent decisions. How do we know they're competent? Because if something goes wrong, people go back and they look at it and they say, well, is this a decision that a regular, competent, reasonable architect doing a similar project in a similar location, would they have made the same kind of decision? So the contracts have to be about things that are about competency and about decision making and about the health, safety, and welfare of the public and about the kind of meeting the responsibilities that you've said you would meet in terms of schedule and all of that. So the contracts have a very specific set of language, and that's what standard of care is about. You will absolutely get a standard of care question. It may not be quite as wordy as this one is, but you will absolutely get a standard of care question. You will absolutely get it in the next one, the project management, but I also think it's likely to get one in practice management, because what it's demonstrating is that difference between your marketing materials and your contractual materials. You have to be a little careful with your marketing. I actually don't like the idea that you would say in your marketing materials that you could do the most beautiful and most energy efficient. Like, you're actually promising things you can't, that you can't sort of reasonably claim. So I don't like those as marketing materials, but it would be confusing about, like, I'm not really sure that you could be sued for that. Whereas the standard of care is talking about contractual elements, and that is what you can be sued over. One quick little side note, D, shall provide information in a timely manner regarding requirements, blah, blah. That's actually talking about what the owner brings to the table, not what the architect brings to the table.
All right, we're down to 29 folks who are still in the mix with
Awesome.
the mock exam answers.
All right. Let's see how they do here. And apologies about the the typos in the writings and all that stuff.
There's no typos.
No typos here. All right. Number 4. While having a construction team meeting with the client, the GC, the structural engineer, and 2 of the contractor subs at your office, your dog bites the client, causing them to slip and fall and ruin their MacBook Pro. Beyond having a stern talking to with your dog, you, the architect, should do what? So this is sort of kind of getting back to the previous question that was saying, you know, would they require you to know E&O and GL and some of these other things that I've abbreviated here? And my guess is that they would always actually write it out, but just for our purposes here, thought we'd kind of mix it up a little bit. So potential answer A, consult your E&O insurance policy. E&O is kind of the old school version of saying errors and omissions. And so that when you're looking at E&O, you're talking about your professional liability.
very inexpensive insurance, right?
Yeah, professional liability is the expensive insurance that architects have to do. The E&O, errors and omissions, that's the big expensive one. The GL is your general liability. So those are two insurance policies that the architect gets, and we'll talk about the difference between them in just a second. C, consult your pro forma documentation. We'll actually talk more about pro forma later, but pro forma doesn't have anything to do with this situation. It's one of those sort of fancy sounding words that you can imagine them throwing into a situation because it does relate to starting a firm, but it doesn't have anything to do with your dog breaking somebody's MacBook Pro. And then D, consult your landlord for their tenant insurance policy. Trust me, your landlord's insurance is not going to pay out because your dog broke somebody's thing. Like, that's on you. If it was a situation where they were walking into the office and there was a walkway outside of your tenant space and there was a trip hazard there and they fell there, well, then that would be on the landlord because that wouldn't be part of your tenant space and it wouldn't be in your sort of meeting yet. So you could imagine a situation where the landlord's insurance would actually get pulled into this. But this is a situation where it's in your office and it's solely your cause because it was your dog. So then the question is, which of A or B is the right one to talk to about this? Well, first thing is, if I have a choice, I'm always going to choose to have it go to the general liability because that's going to be the cheaper one. I don't want to start getting a list of things going on underneath my professional liability. I don't really have a choice, though. The professional liability is about your decision making. Like, I'm doing a project and we've decided that we're going to have 2 stairwells for a very large scale building. Is that enough stairwells? Can people get out in a fire? Does the code official agree? Did the project get stopped because you didn't have enough exit ways? And the reason that you didn't have enough exit ways is because you made a decision that had fewer exits than what was necessary, right? That's a professional liability question. That's the kind of thing that's your decision making. General liability is somebody tripped on your rug, or you're driving the business car and there's an accident with something. Like, it's all the stuff that you're an architect, but maybe you're a dry cleaner, or maybe you're a lawyer, or maybe you're somebody else. Like, everybody has general liability insurance. So if it falls under the kind of thinking, like something went wrong, but it could go wrong for anybody, then that's general liability. If it could really only be the architect that the dispute is about, then that's probably the professional liability errors and omissions. You'll hear both terms, errors and omissions. Most of the time, I think they actually would say the whole thing, errors and omissions, professional liability insurance. But in some places, you'll get referred to as professional liability. Some places get referred to as errors and omissions. Some places, both terms altogether. Errors and omissions is kind of an old term, like it's kind of the old school term for it. When I actually just had to sign a new one the other day, and it didn't even say errors and omissions on it. It only said professional liability. So I think it's moving towards professional liability, but it's the same thing. And absolutely have a stern talking to your dog, because that's ridiculous.
Okay.
All right, number 5. Risk reduction is a concern on a project that seems complicated and difficult. The architect should make sure they have which of the following. So a couple of these are pretty easy and reasonable. I'm going to sort of pick out the easy ones first. So C, regular coordination meetings. This is one of the ones that NCARB is going to like smash home every chance they get. It's one of the roles of the architect is to make sure that everything is coordinated, that you're hiring typically the consultants, so the engineers, you're the liaison to the owner, you are therefore also the liaison to the general contractor and to all the subs through the general contractor. And if there's risk involved, the risk is typically going to be about coordination issues. There's lots of other potential risks, but certainly coordination is one of the biggest problems that happens on job sites. So you will absolutely get questions about making sure that you are setting up your office in such a way that you are always making sure that there are coordination processes that everybody is following. So that's going to be a big one. A design log kind of goes along with that. A design log is every change that happens in a design, you're supposed to keep track of those changes. So you have a system for whatever is going on. A client calls up and says, I don't like the awning windows, make those casements, or something like that. That it doesn't just change on the drawings, you actually keep track of those changes. And the reason that you make a log of that is because somewhere down the road, 3 months, 6 months, 12 months down the road, somebody's going to say, well, wait a minute, why did we end up with these awning windows when the drawing said, casement windows? And you need to be able to go back and find the moment so that it's clear when those decisions actually were made, right? That's part of reducing everybody's risk, specifically your risk, but also everybody else's risk. Another one that's sort of an easy one would be a quality assurance plan. Now, this is one of those things that sounds very good in the NCARB and in the AIA documents. If you look at the professional practice handbook, there would be a bunch of stuff in there about quality assurance plans. And what that's essentially saying is you should have a process that you go through for projects. So you're going through, you get an initial project, you do schematic design, there's a sign off where the owner agrees to the schematic design, they sign off. At some point, maybe you have a third-party reviewer. It doesn't have to be an outside of the office, but maybe somebody who's just not involved in those drawings who can kind of look over and make sure that code issues are being picked up and things like that. But the point is that you have a plan for how you produce work. And the quality assurance is always checking, does it still meet the code? Does it still meet the budget? Does it still meet the program? So you have a way to do that. And again, this is talking about practice management. So you're talking about issues that are sort of setting up the future, right? And so a quality assurance plan would absolutely be an example of that. So those are the three really easy ones from an NCARB standpoint. And then the fourth one is a little trickier and could go a couple different ways. I'm going to claim it as a performance bond. And a performance bond means that when this project goes through, everybody's worried about the risk, and that the performance bond is going to be the thing where there's a surety involved that is going to say, all right, if the contractor has been chosen, that as the project goes through, if for some reason they try to back out, there's an insurance to cover that situation. So if you're worried about the project not going through, that having a performance bond in there would make a big difference in terms of reducing everybody's worry and risk. That you don't have to stop and then redesign and then do some new thing with a new contractor that's going to cause a lot more coordination and complication. So those are the four that I would pick. Bid bond you could do. Employee manual is also pretty reasonable, but those are the four that I think are the best out of those six. All right, number 6. Starting a firm, what sort of financial forms should you create to understand the viability of the endeavor? So we have 4 different possibilities here, A, profit and loss statement, B, pro forma, C, cash flow reports, D, loan agreement. So if we look back and we're kind of trying to figure out what's going on, we're talking about we're starting a firm, so it's not a firm that's already going, and we're looking at the viability of it. So is this a viable idea? So nothing has really happened yet other than thinking about it. So when we look through these, a profit and loss statement, well, P&L is when I have costs that have gone out and I have money having come in. So I'm looking to see, do they match? Do I have enough money to cover the costs that go out and all of that? So that's only when something is going already. So it's not A. Similar, a cash flow report, C, doesn't make any sense either, because a cash flow report is talking about the flow of money. That's like how much cash do we have on hand and how does it relate to the amounts of money that we're going to be paying out as we go along. So the only two possible ones really are B and D, a pro forma and a loan agreement. And kind of interestingly, if you're going to get a loan in order to start a business, you're going to need a pro forma. Now, you may not call it that. It can be referred to as a spreadsheet, or there's any number of ways you might talk about it. But a pro forma is a document that goes through and says, here's what we think the incomes will be. Here's what we think the costs will be. And so the costs would be, all right, we're going to go for a year. How much will it cost us to pay our employees? How much will it cost for insurance? How much will it cost for rent? How much will it cost for computers? You're kind of putting all of the costs out there. And then on the income, you're saying, well, we think we'll be able to get 2 small projects and 3 big projects over the span of the year. And we think that those will bring in revenues of X amount, and you can add them all up. And then if you can add up the revenues and they're more than the costs going out, then that's a viable pro forma. You're essentially saying that those numbers will work. Pro forma can be as simple as a few lines on an Excel spreadsheet. It doesn't have to be super complicated. But they can also be, much more complicated, where you start bringing in loans that you're saying, well, our loan amount, so we're not going to try to cover this year's amount right away. We're going to be able to sort of use this over a span of time. So they can be quite complicated, but in general, the gist of them is pretty simple. It's just saying, is this a viable enterprise? This is how much money we think we'll have coming in. This is how much money we think we'll have going out. Does it make sense to start this business? If you're going to get a loan from somebody, they are absolutely going to want to see that document, because you can't, if you're getting a loan from somebody and they don't believe that you're a viable entity, then they're not going to give you that loan. So this is one of the ways that you would show people that you are actually a viable endeavor. So the answer is going to be B. You're going to do a pro forma. All right.
All right, let's see how we're doing. Are we under 20 now, Stephen?
Yes.
Under 20.
Okay, here we go. Last couple. Number 7. An owner that has a number of strip malls is looking to have an ongoing series of small projects worked on over the next few years as new tenants move in and out. They should probably produce a RFP, RFS, RFQ, feasibility study. Well, feasibility study is not a bad thing to respond. It's actually a fairly reasonable idea. In this situation, like if you imagine that an owner has just bought a series of strip malls and they want to know kind of who they should be marketing to and what kinds of businesses would make sense. Well, you do a feasibility study. That's the kind of thing that would be a reasonable thing for them to do. But it doesn't quite match what the question is really about. You might help with a feasibility study, but it doesn't fit to the question. So D is not the answer. So the question really is it an RFP, an RFS, or an RFQ? And that's a request for a proposal, a request for services, or a request for qualifications. And an RFP, request for a proposal, that is about when you have a specific situation. So you have an owner, they want to do a project, and they're going to ask to see who's interested in the project and what ideas do they have to bring to the table to make this project exciting and viable. So you are not just saying who's interested, you're actually asking them to provide ideas. But the question is talking about something that's happening over a span of time, multiple tenants moving in and out. Maybe you've got a couple in one year and 5 in another and none in another and 3 in another, right? So it's a constantly sort of churning along thing. An RFP is really about a specific situation. It doesn't really fit to that multiple type situation. So it's really between the RFS and the RFQ. RFQ, the request for qualifications. I would actually do an RFQ if I was doing an RFP. I would do the same work for the qualifications, but then I would add the proposal part on top of it for an RFP. Well, the same is kind of true with an RFS. An RFQ is saying, are we qualified to do the work? So it's a way of sort of pre-qualifying people so you can kind of weed out a bunch of the potential architects and their teams so that an owner can sort of focus in on making a decision between just a few. So if I'm doing an RFS, that's a big, long RFS, it essentially includes the RFQ in it. And the RFQ would be, yes, we're qualified, here's the team that we would have working on it, this is how we would sort of do this work. An RFS is going to be the answer, so it's a request for services because it's going to be an ongoing set of work. So whenever you have those situations where it's more like you're being put on retainer, it's going to be an RFS.
I think with that, we squashed everyone.
Ha! There you go. You'll see it in a few different ways. You could actually do it with RFPs and RFQs. RFQ is probably a better answer than an RFP in that situation, but an RFS would certainly fit that situation where it's this constant flow of work. You're probably doing it hourly. You're not. The whole point here is that they don't want to have separate contracts with every time a laundromat moves out. They want to be able to just kind of make something happen for the next people to be able to get them in as fast as possible.
Okay.
All right, number 8. You are unsure about an unusual project proposal. It is not a typical type of project, and it is unclear how long developing the plans will take. You should probably propose to the client A, a cost plus fee contract type, B, a stipulated sum, C, design build project delivery, D, a GMP. GMP means guaranteed maximum price, and GMP is actually not a bad answer if it's associated with a couple of the other answers, but by itself it doesn't really answer the situation. So this is a situation where there's something is like it's a project type that's unusual. There's not a lot of documentation about how people have done them in the past. Maybe it's something that's new materials, or maybe it's a type of project where you're including some new sustainability aspect to it, or you're generating power or something like that, that's just sort of unusual and nobody's really 100% sure how to do it. If you use a stipulated sum, that means essentially a lump sum in your contract. Well, if I said to you here's a project, I really have no idea how long it's going to take us, and you said, well, give me an exact number. Well, I'm obviously going to add a whole lot of money into that. I'm going to puff it out in order to just cover me for in case it takes the whole time. You know, if I think it'll take 100 hours, but I put in that it's going to take 200 hours, then if it ends up taking 170 hours, like, all right, I'm covered, right? Well, that's a terrible idea for the client, because that means they're paying this enormous amount of money just because it's a complicated project. So stipulated sum, while in most situations is probably the reasonable way to go, it just doesn't make sense in a situation where there's a lot of, everybody's unsure about it. Design build really isn't, that's a project delivery, that's not part of what we're talking about. Though it could be, but it's not directly from the question, so it doesn't seem a real potential answer. So when it comes down to it, the answer is going to be A, which is a cost plus fee contract type. So what that means is you're essentially saying that we're going to do this hourly, and that the hourly construct is what the cost is. So interestingly, this is one of the things that always throws young architects a lot, is you probably think the cost is how much they're paying you, but in fact, the cost is a combination of how much they're paying you, and then a sort of proration of the insurance, the rent, the vehicle costs, all of those other costs that it takes to run a practice. And so you actually have to show all those costs and the timesheets so that the client would actually be able to see that they were getting their money's worth, that they were actually paying per hour for hours that have actually been worked. But then the fee is that extra little bit of profit that you're sort of allowed to build on. So it's a complicated situation, it's an unusual project, nobody's sure how long it's going to take. So therefore, in order to get you to not just pad the number, and therefore, if you're able to do it really fast, still charge the client a whole lot of money, instead of doing that, you would choose something like cost plus fee. That's a way that everybody gets paid a sort of reasonable amount, but there's no extra padding because the client sees the actual number of hours that the architect has worked. So the cost would be different. If I have a principal working on it, it's going to be a higher amount per hour than if I have an intern or a project architect, or everybody would have different hourly amounts. They tend to be about 3 times the amount of money that you're being paid hourly. Sometimes some areas it might be up to about 4 times. Depends, it's sort of a cultural difference and some other issues around the country. But that cost plus fee is the sort of straight cost plus a built-in profit. Now, it's possible that the client might just balk at that because really they're just going to pay you hourly. Like, you could just keep working on something forever. And so they might demand that it's cost plus fee, but with a GMP, with a guaranteed maximum price. And so you might, have some limit that you say, all right, we promise that it won't go over this amount, just so that they have the ability to make sure that they have loans to cover it and all of that. So this is the kind of thing that you start thinking about in these scenarios. You're trying to put together a firm. Well, how do you organize? How do you get paid? What's the way that you're going to get projects? So am I doing RFPs? Am I putting out 10 RFPs on the hope that I'm going to get 1 for every 10 that I put out, or 2 for every 10 that I put out? Once you start to look at those things, you realize, well, there's a certain amount of hourly time it takes to get all that information out in order to get the projects. Once I'm starting to get the projects, I have to figure out, well, what kinds of projects can I charge in what different ways and what makes sense. Clients will be willing to do certain things in certain situations and not in other situations. In a fairly simple, straightforward situation, I'm probably not going to want to pay somebody hourly because I want to have a clear idea of how much money that's going to cost. There's no reason in that situation. So those are the kinds of questions that we're really talking about here is, imagine you're sort of trying to figure out, how do I get projects? What do I need to do for an office? I have to get insurance. I have to figure out how I'm going to organize the team. I have to have a series of processes that we go through. So we have the quality assurance plans. We've got the design logs. We've got we're using AIA contracts. We've got that you've sort of set up the process, and that's what these kinds of questions are going to be about. Is about sort of making sure that you've gone through and understand the kind of ramifications of all of these different choices.
Yeah, so we have a bunch of good questions here. Could you do me a favor real quick and go back to question 5, I think it was?
Okay.
Is that the one you were looking for, Stephen? Okay, cool. You have everything you need? Yeah. Okay, cool. How many does that leave us with? 5 or 7? In the meantime, if you go back to slide 8, Karen had a good question. She said, doesn't cost plus fee refer to the billing by the contractor, not the architect? She thought that the architect fee is referred to as hourly, which would factor in profit and overhead.
Yeah, it's actually the same terminology can be used for both the general contractors and for the architects. Cost plus fee is definitely used for contractors. Hourly is often used for architects. The thing about hourly is it doesn't necessarily include a extra profit number. So it's just covering all the costs. So that means if you're just doing hourly, you have to really make sure that you are in fact covering all of the costs. A cost plus fee is set up to be not only the costs, but then there's an acknowledged profit amount, and that could be for either the architect or for the general contractor.
Okay, good. And then I think if you go back, I think it was 6 or 5, I'm not entirely sure, the one would include performance bond. Yeah, this one. A lot of people, I would say Daniel, Peggy, Sarah, I'll ask questions about, isn't it more typical for a contractor to have performance bond versus architects?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm actually suggesting that would be for the contractor. So yes, you're absolutely right about that. I should have made that clearer. That in a situation, what I was trying to get at was in a situation where there's confusion and a lot of potential risk, and you're trying to reduce the amount of risk, one of the sort of big risky moments is will the contractor actually play out their contract? And that if they don't, then there's a huge amount of effort, mostly for the owner, but it's actually a very risky situation for the architect as well, because now in your sort of process of coordination, every time you bring in a different new general contractor, there's always going to be confusion about, well, we submitted that information already, but no, you submitted it to the old contractor, not to the new contractor, and it's just sort of bound to be sort of confusion. And so by suggesting to the owner that they should have a performance bond as part of the contract with the contractor, that's a way of sort of helping mitigate your risk.
Okay. And then going back to, I believe it was maybe the second or third one, which had IDM in it. There you go, number 2. I think Joe asked a good point here. He says, I've never fully understood the IDM concept. Doesn't that put the architect in a conflict of interest to rule against his owner?
Yeah, it's a funny one. I'm totally with you, which is why I have a number of very officious friends who who know all the rules about everything and are totally perfect people for the IDM. But in actuality, most of the time, the IDM just feels a little awkward for people. And so I actually don't think it's used as much as the AIA lawyers thought it would be when they put it into the 2007 documents. The idea, if you can help people not get to litigation, well, that's huge, right? Because litigation just costs so much and it takes so unbelievably long. And even when you get down to even mediation, right? Mediation takes, months. Like you bring in somebody new and they have to go through all the, design logs, and they have to look at all the submittals and the change orders, and they have to get used to all that information. It's going to take a month or two just for them to get up to speed. Well, if it's a construction project, a month or two is, potentially a crazy long time. So even mediation, which is meant to be the easiest of those three, litigation, arbitration, and mediation, even that one is potentially tricky and takes a long time. And so the idea is, well, let's just have somebody who's already involved, already knows the thing, and they literally just change hats, right? And the architect, and it doesn't have to be the architect, it's just that it's assumed to be the architect unless a different person is named. So on the contract, there's actually a little line that says the IDM assumed to be the architect unless you name somebody else. And so it could be somebody else, but the thought that you have somebody who's already involved is not either the contractor or the owner. Clearly you have more agency and relationship to the owner than you do to the contractor. So it does seem like it's a bit of a problem. But remember, this is that whole idea about being a professional, is that, whether it's true or not, you are supposed to be above that, right? That you are supposed to be able to look at it rationally and with a sort of jaundiced eye and be able to say, yes, is this, the owner is acting reasonably or the owner is not acting reasonably in this situation. And that as the initial decision maker, you're sort of helping sort of throw out all the red herrings and really just get to the actual issue.
You just said jaundiced eye and
red herring in one sentence.
I have no idea what those things are. It's disgusting.
So it's a way of sort of getting at all of those issues with somebody who's already in the know so that you can do it fast. But I'm totally with you. I forget the name of who it was, but I'm totally with you. It is a little weird, and I think that's why it's not done as much as they thought it would be when they originally put it into the contracts.
Okay, and then if we go to the first question, Julie's had a comment here. I believe it was this one. He said, would it be okay if this was offered as a deduct to the project?
Now, very good question. I actually meant to say that. I'm glad you asked that question. It's a totally different question if the roofing supplier is saying, hey, I've got a cheaper roofing material, you might want to consider it. It'll bring down the cost for the overall construction. That's a completely different question. It doesn't include a kickback. It's just making the project cheaper. You absolutely do that all the time. Maybe not quite that obviously, but on every project, you're going to be talking to the GC, and the GC is talking to their suppliers, and one of the suppliers is going to say, you asked for all of these, Kohler plumbing fixtures, but we rep American Standard, and so we'll just be cheaper if we can do it as an American Standard. Can you ask if we can do that? Right? That's a completely reasonable thing to do. That's about the budget of the project. That's fine. Everybody wants you to bring the budget of the project down. The issue is whether you are secretly getting paid in order to make certain decisions.
Awesome. Well, we're going to end it there. I want to thank everybody for all your questions. They were really good. And I want to thank you, Mike, and thanks everyone again who tuned in. If you'd like to attend our next ARE live broadcast, where we're going to be focusing on the second of ARE 5 exams, which is the project management exam, you can visit blackspectacles.com/podcast to register to attend. And just like today's episode, you have a chance to ask questions and share your answers with Mike for live feedback during the broadcast.
And thanks for those. Those are really great questions.
Yeah. To learn more about our ARE exam prep curriculum, you can go to blackspectacles.com, where you can try out any of the free course videos. And if you, like I said earlier, if you want your boss to pay for your membership, be sure to visit blackspectacles.com/firms to learn more about our firm memberships for firms of really any size, small, medium, large.
They should pay for your black spectacles and for your exams.
Yeah, no kidding. And for those of you who are ready to start preparing for the ARE, and if you're already an AIA member, you can use coupon code 32917PMYT to get a 15% discount for the entire duration of your ARE exam prep membership. And then finally, leave a comment below the video to let us know what you think. Share any suggestions you may have. I promise we'll read every word that you write and use them to tune our next episodes. So thanks for watching.